Everyone in Newport, Rhode Island, believed the woman in the wheelchair was the bravest person in that house. Margot Winslow had a Newport last name, a diamond on her left hand, and a chair she hadn't left in 4 years, and when guests came, she smiled the way a woman smiles when she's decided to be strong about something terrible. Behind closed doors, that same woman leaned toward the housekeeper, pushing her up the boathouse ramp, and said, "Move faster, you slow little thing, or you'll be scrubbing floors back in Fall River by Friday." Josephine Keene didn't answer. She was 27. She kept her head down, and there were 2 fingers on her left hand that wouldn't ever close all the way again. She used to teach violin to children. Now she pushed a chair up a ramp and said nothing, because the woman in that chair was engaged to Ezra Vasari, and in that part of Rhode Island nobody said anything at all about the Vasari family. Ezra was 34. He owned the shipping company, the construction outfit, and every dock permit on that stretch of water crossed his desk. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. He'd sold his father's boat and torn out a wall to put in an elevator because he believed he was the reason that woman couldn't walk, and he carried it with him every single morning. 3 nights before that afternoon on the ramp, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Josie went down to the boathouse to get something she kept hidden there, and through the glass she saw something she was never meant to see. She told no one. She had far too much to lose: a mother in a nursing home outside Providence, and a bed that had already run out of money. But less than 2 weeks later, in front of 200 guests, that quiet housekeeper did one thing, one small thing that took her no longer than a single breath, and by the end of that night, nothing in the Vasari house was ever the same again. People in Newport still won't talk about what happened at that engagement party, so if this story moves you, please give it a like. It helps the channel more than you know. Share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet people aren't weak people. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now let's go back to that ramp in Newport, to one woman's voice and another woman's silence, and find out exactly what a housekeeper is capable of when she finally has nothing left to lose. The wheelchair reached the top of the slope and came to a stop on the rooftop terrace of the boathouse, and at that very moment, a gardener passed below with a coil of hose over his shoulder. Margot's voice changed completely, softening and warming into the voice of a woman grateful for every hand that helped her. "Thank you, Josie. You push more gently than anyone before you." The gardener greeted her with a slight bow of his head and continued on his way. Margot waited until the sound of his footsteps had faded completely before speaking again, her voice returning to what it had been. The blanket. Josie picked up the thin blanket from the arm of the chair, shook it once to smooth it, folded it into exactly 4 neat sections, and laid it across Margot's legs, adjusting the edge until it was perfectly aligned with the side of the chair. She had done this every day since the first afternoon she entered that house, and 4 months was long enough for her hands to know what to do, without waiting for her mind to tell them. Margot looked down at her legs and then out across the water. Josie stood behind the chair, her eyes fixed on the water as well, and neither woman said another word. There was only one sentence in Josie's mind, the same sentence she had repeated to herself for the past 3 nights, that perhaps what she had seen through the glass of the boathouse that day had been a trick of her eyes, caused by the darkness, caused by her exhaustion. She believed it for barely half a breath, and then she didn't. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, she went down to the kitchen. Bertie was bent over a pot, her silver hair tied neatly beneath a scarf, and she asked no questions. She simply ladled out a bowl of soup and set it before Josie with a slice of bread already cut, the kind of caring she never gave a name. "Eat. It's cold up there." Josie sat down, wrapping both hands around the bowl to warm them, while Bertie leaned against the table, drying her hands on a towel, her eyes turned toward the backyard. "The girl before you," she said, "didn't last 2 weeks." Josie looked up. Bertie was still staring out into the yard. "I've worked in this house since Master Ezra was too young to walk. I cook, I clean, I keep this kitchen spotless, and I have one rule that I suggest you make your own." She turned, and this time she looked directly at Josie. "In this house, don't look at anything longer than you need to. Look at the floor just long enough to know it's clean. Look at the wheelchair just long enough to know the brake is set. Don't look for 1 second more." Josie put down her spoon. Where did she go? Bertie picked up the towel, folded it, and hung it on its hook. She walked to the pot, lifted the lid, stirred once, and put the lid back on. She didn't answer, and Josie understood that her silence didn't mean she didn't know. That night, before turning out the light, Josie cleared out the bottom drawer of the cabinet in the servants' room, the drawer she hadn't opened in 4 months, because it was stuck and because she had nothing to put inside it. There was a hair clip, 2 coins, and an envelope that had already been opened, the kind used for bills. On the front was the name of a girl Josie had never heard of, and in the upper left corner was a return address on a street in Pawtucket. She had just picked it up to examine it when Bertie passed the doorway carrying a stack of clean towels and paused for exactly 1 beat. "Don't tell anyone I gave you that," she said. Then she continued down the hall. She didn't step into the room. She didn't hold out her hand to take it back. Josie stood in the yellow light of the small room, the envelope in her hand, listening as Bertie's footsteps faded all the way down the corridor. Friday morning was her day off, and Josie took 2 buses into Providence, the envelope with the Pawtucket address resting in her coat pocket the entire way, and she didn't take it out even once. The Harbor Light Institute stood at the end of a road lined with low trees, and the person at the reception desk knew her face so well that a raised hand in greeting was all it took before Josie walked straight down the corridor on the left to the 3rd room. Her mother was sitting by the window in a blue sweater worn thin at the elbows, and resting on her knees was the cheapest kind of student notebook, the kind with a soft cover and ruled squares, and she was writing. She wrote slowly, her head tilted slightly to one side, the ballpoint pen held tightly in her hand as though the words might escape if she loosened her grip even a little. Josie stood in the doorway for a while before stepping inside. "Mom." Deirdre looked up, and in her eyes was the gentle courtesy Josie had learned to endure, the look of someone trying to pretend she had known you before. "Are you in the room on the right? I'm Josie." Josie. She repeated the name as though recalling a word from an old song, not as though speaking the name of her own daughter. Then she looked toward the door, past Josie's shoulder, into the empty hallway. "Where is Aiden?" Josie pulled the plastic chair close to the bed and sat down, and she answered exactly as she had answered 100 times before, with the same tone and at the same pace, neither faster nor slower, because she knew that if even 1 beat fell out of rhythm, her mother would ask again. "He's working, Mom. He has work today. He works too much." Deirdre nodded and looked down at the notebook. "Tell him to come home for dinner." "I will." An attendant came in to change the water pitcher, a middle-aged woman with a loud voice and quick hands. And she looked at the notebook, then at Josie with the knowing sympathy of someone who had done this work for many years. "She writes all the time. She has for 4 years now, ever since she first came here. Some days she writes all afternoon, and some days she writes until dark. We let her write. Having something to do keeps her from getting restless." The woman lowered her voice, but not enough. "It doesn't make any sense, though. It's the writing of someone who has forgotten. The other day I picked it up to have a look, and she just kept repeating herself, writing 1 line, and then writing that same line again. It was heartbreaking." Josie thanked her. The woman left the room. The notebook remained open on her mother's knees, 2 pages filled with writing, and Josie looked at it for exactly 1 second before turning away, because Bertie had been right. Some things shouldn't be looked at longer than necessary, even though Bertie had been speaking about another house and another matter entirely. Josie didn't open it. She hadn't opened it once in 4 years. She thought she knew what was inside, and what she believed she knew was that her mother's handwriting was fading a little more each day, each page more distorted than the one before it, and she didn't have the courage to see that decline arranged in lines across the paper. The money for this bed had run out in March, and now, every month, Josie covered the cost with exactly what she earned from the Vasari household, not a penny less and not a penny more. Deirdre wrote 1 more line, and then stopped, the pen still clasped in her hand, and she looked through the window at the low trees and the stretch of cloudless sky beyond them. "I'm trying to remember something," she said. "I keep trying, but I can't. I remember it every morning." "It's all right, Mom. It's important." Josie reached across and placed her hand over her mother's hand, the hand still holding the pen, and she held it there without saying anything more until the fingers beneath her palm stopped trembling. On Saturday afternoon, Bertie loaded 2 containers into the trunk of the car and told Josie to take the delivery down to Rosalie. 2 crates of vegetables and 1 crate of fish packed in ice, and she reminded her to use the back entrance, the kitchen door, and not the front. Rosalie's restaurant stood in a neighborhood about 10 minutes from the harbor, the kind of restaurant with a heavy wooden door and a sign so old that the lettering had faded, and its rear entrance opened onto a narrow alley thick with the smell of cooking oil and the sea. Josie rang the bell, but no one came. The door was only pulled shut, not locked, so she pushed it gently and stepped inside with the crate of vegetables in her arms. The hallway beyond was dark, lit by a single bulb in the middle. The kitchen was on the left, while on the right, a door stood open by no more than the width of a hand. She intended to walk straight into the kitchen, but then she looked through the opening on the right, and she stopped. It was a long room, the kind old restaurant still reserved for family banquets, with a long wooden table in the center, and chairs arranged neatly along both sides, every one of them empty. 7 or 8 men stood along the walls. Some wore coats, while others wore work clothes, still covered in dust. One man held a hat in his hands and kept turning the brim back and forth. Another had a folder tucked beneath his arm. There were enough chairs for all of them, with more to spare. Chairs arranged neatly less than a single step from where they stood, and not one man was sitting. They stood, and they waited. At the head of the table sat Ezra Vasari. His hands rested on the tabletop, and before him was a cup of coffee. Josie stared at that coffee longer than she had intended, because its surface was perfectly still, without a ripple, without the trace of a lip against the rim, and she realized that he hadn't taken a single sip, and had no intention of doing so. The cup was simply there, as though it were something that gave his hands a place to rest. A man at the far end of the wall stepped forward. He took 3 steps and stopped a respectful distance from the head of the table. He spoke briefly, and in a low voice, and Josie caught only a few words. She heard contract, next month, and permit. Ezra listened. He didn't look up once while the man was speaking, and when the man finished, Ezra answered with a single sentence, perhaps only 10 words, none of which Josie could make out clearly. The man nodded twice and thanked him, and the way he expressed his gratitude reminded Josie of how people thanked someone at a clinic after being given an appointment sooner than expected. Then he left, passing directly in front of the opening in the door, and Josie managed to step back half a pace before he saw her. The second man approached the head of the table, then the third. No one interrupted. No one spoke before his turn, and in that entire long room, not a single voice rose above the level of ordinary conversation. Josie had worked in many places. She had stood in many rooms among rich people and poor people, and she knew the look of those waiting for a favor to be granted. But no one here was pleading. These were grown men who had come to discuss business, and every one of them had chosen to remain standing. "What are you doing there?" Rosalie had come into the hallway, a towel still in her hand. She didn't raise her voice, but she took Josie by the elbow, pulled her straight into the kitchen, and closed the kitchen door behind them. "Give me the crate of vegetables." She took it, set it on the table, then turned and looked at Josie. "That room isn't a place for people like us, child. It isn't for me, it isn't for you, and it isn't for Bertie. I go into that room to bring out the coffee, and then I leave. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "I understand." Rosalie watched her for a moment, and then her expression softened. She went to the refrigerator, took out a paper box tied with string, and pressed it into Josie's hands. "Almond cakes. Take them to your mother when you go to Providence tomorrow. People who forget many things often remember flavors." On Sunday, at the Vasari house, it was the only day of the week when the entire family ate together, and Rosalie did all the cooking herself, allowing Bertie to do nothing except the washing. Josie stood in the corner of the dining room near the kitchen door, waiting to pour water and clear the plates, and she heard the wheels before she saw the person. Those wheels sounded different. They moved forward at a steady pace without hesitation, and they entered the room in one clean turn around the foot of the cabinet, the turn of someone who had passed that spot thousands of times. Sloane Vasari propelled herself into the room, both hands resting on the wheel rims, and by the time Rosalie stepped forward to help, she had already reached the table. She was 24 years old, with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, and when she lifted herself slightly to adjust her position, Josie saw clearly how her shoulders worked, how a body divided its burden when its lower half could offer no help. Sloane locked the brakes with 2 fingers without looking down. Then she reached for the water pitcher and poured herself a glass. Margot was brought in afterward, and Ezra was the one pushing her. He moved slowly, asked twice whether her seat was comfortable, then adjusted the footrest himself until it fit properly. Margot thanked him in the small, slightly breathless voice Josie had heard throughout the past 4 months, the voice that appeared only when other people were in the room. She sat leaning slightly to one side, one hand resting on the arm of the chair as though she needed the support, and when Rosalie set a plate before her, she picked up her fork and then put it down again. "I'll eat slowly, Mother," Sitting too long has been tiring me lately. Rosalie told her it was all right, and that she should eat as much as she could. 2 wheelchairs stood at opposite ends of the same table. Josie remained in the corner of the room, looking at both of them, and she couldn't think of any way not to look. The meal was about halfway through when someone mentioned summer, then the water, and Rosalie said without looking at anyone, "Their father loved that boat dearly. Once it's sold, that will be the end of it, and I won't speak of it again." Then she immediately changed the subject and asked Sloane when her examination was. Ezra said nothing. He didn't look up from his plate. He cut a piece of meat, ate it, and set down his knife, and through all of it, he didn't raise his head even once. Josie could see clearly that everyone at the table knew better than to raise their heads for him. Sloane answered Rosalie's question about the examination and told a story about her contract law professor, and everyone at the table laughed. Margot laughed as well, and when her laughter ended, she lifted one hand and gently rubbed her shoulder, the gesture of someone who had been sitting for too long. By the time Josie stepped forward to pour water for Sloane, the meal was nearly over. Sloane pushed her glass toward her and said thank you. Then she looked across the table at Margot's 2 hands resting on her napkin and spoke very softly, in the voice someone might use to comment on the weather. "The skin on your hands has been looking better lately, Margot." Margot smiled gratefully. "I changed to a different cream." "Yes." Sloane picked up her glass of water. "That must be it." Then she drank. Rosalie rose to bring out the cake, and Ezra asked Margot whether she wanted to go out onto the veranda. The remark passed across the table without settling on anyone. No one noticed, but Josie stood there with the water pitcher in her hand, and she had pushed Margot's chair up and down the slope to the boathouse every day for 4 months. She knew what wheel rims did to a person's palms. She knew where the thin bands of calloused skin formed, and she knew how they thickened. She looked at Margot's hands resting on the white napkin, and there was nothing on them at all. She raised her eyes, and Sloane was watching her from across the table. At noon on Monday, 2 guests arrived, a married couple from the neighborhood across the bay, to discuss the seating arrangements for the engagement party. Bertie served tea on the veranda, while Josie waited at the edge of the veranda as she always did. Margot sat between the 2 guests, talking about the flowers, the music, and how she wanted everything to be simple this year, and she spoke in the small, breathless voice whose every pause Josie had learned to anticipate. Then, while the woman was admiring the potted plants, Margot looked down at her feet and said the footrest was crooked, and she called Josie's name in one clipped syllable. Josie stepped forward. The footrest wasn't crooked. It was exactly where it had been since morning. But Josie knelt in front of the chair, before both guests, and reached out to adjust it. She loosened the screw on the right, pushed the footrest inward by 1 notch, and tightened it again. She worked slowly because 2 fingers on her left hand couldn't bend fully, and each time she tightened the screw, she had to use her remaining 3 fingers together with her palm. Above her head, Margot continued speaking, her voice cheerful, as though she were telling an amusing story in the middle of a party. "This girl, used to teach music. She taught violin to children in Fall River. Can you imagine?" Then something happened to her hand. "Josie, hold out your hand and let them see, dear." The woman said there was no need, but she spoke in the voice of someone who had just been invited to look at something she was already curious about. Josie stood and held out her left hand, turning her palm upward, the 2 fingers curved and unable to straighten. She held it there for about 3 breaths. The man looked away. The woman said something about how advanced medicine had become these days. Margot said, "Yes, it's such a shame," and then changed the subject to the tablecloths. Josie lowered her hand. She didn't cry. She stood there with the hand she had just lowered resting beside her hip, and she didn't cry. Later, when she looked back on that moment, she wouldn't be able to remember what she had been thinking. She would remember only that her mind had gone very quiet. The tea was finished, and the 2 guests rose to leave. Margot gestured toward Josie with 2 fingers, the motion she always used to tell her to push the chair. Josie walked around behind the wheelchair. She placed both hands on the handles. Then she removed them and stepped aside. She said nothing. She simply stood 1 step away from the chair, her arms hanging at her sides, and looked out across the water. A silence followed that lasted longer than an ordinary silence was permitted to last. Margot sat motionless, and because Josie wasn't looking at her, she didn't know what expression was on her face. But she heard the fabric of Margot's clothes brush against the side of the chair. Then she heard 2 hands grip the wheel rims, and then the chair began to move. It moved with certainty. It turned halfway around in place on the veranda floor, then rolled straight toward the door without hesitation, without the short, awkward movements of someone just learning. Beneath her silk blouse, Margot's shoulders worked exactly as Sloane's shoulders had worked at the dining table on Sunday, except Sloane had been doing it for 8 years. While Margot was doing it in front of 2 guests who had just heard her say that sitting too long had been tiring her lately, the man watched the wheelchair. The woman looked at Josie. No one said a word. They said goodbye to Bertie and went out to their car. Ezra had returned earlier than expected. His car had been parked at the head of the driveway for some time, and he stood there with his keys still in his hand. That evening, he knocked at the kitchen door. Josie was wiping down the table. He didn't enter. He remained in the doorway and told her he was sorry for what had happened on the veranda that afternoon, that it hadn't been right, and that he would speak to Margot about it. He said Margot was going through so much that sometimes she lost control of herself, but that still didn't make it right. Then he wished Josie good night and left. Josie stood with the cloth in her hand, and the cold that ran down her spine didn't come from his apology. It came from hearing a man defend his future wife with the very excuse she had invented to deceive him. And he had spoken those words with complete sincerity. It was nearly midnight, and every light in the house had been turned off. Josie couldn't sleep, so she went down to the kitchen, bringing with her the violin case from the boathouse. She placed the violin on the kitchen table beneath the hanging lamp and began working on its bridge, the small piece of wood that supported the strings at the center of the instrument, because it had been leaning to one side since the previous winter, and she had never once straightened it. She held it between the index and middle fingers of her right hand, pushed gently, studied it, then pushed again. Her left hand steadied the body of the violin. She worked at it for a very long time, much longer than necessary, and she didn't hear the footsteps. Ezra stood in the kitchen doorway for a while before speaking, and when he did, it was to apologize for startling her. He didn't turn on another light. He walked over, pulled out the chair at the end of the table, and sat down a comfortable distance from her, his eyes on the violin. "Who made this?" he asked. "My husband," Josie said. "He was a carpenter. He made doors, staircases, cabinets, and one year, he made this." He had never made a violin before, and he never made another one afterward. He gave it to me on our wedding day. Ezra looked at the open lid of the violin case on the table, at the fabric lining worn thin in one corner, then at the body of the violin and the narrow inlay running around the wooden face. He said the inlay had been done by hand, not by a machine, and Josie said yes, her husband had set it in himself. Ezra asked nothing more about the violin. He sat quietly for a while, then asked if she would play something for him. Josie said, "I can't play anymore." He didn't say anything. He didn't tell her to try. He didn't say it didn't matter. He didn't say he believed she could do it. He simply sat there without taking back what he had asked, and his refusal to withdraw the request rested on the kitchen table between them like a physical thing. And so, Josie raised the violin to her shoulder. She lifted her left elbow and placed all 4 fingers against the neck. The 2 fingers that couldn't bend remained curled where they were, unable to reach the strings, touching only the palm of her own hand. She drew the bow. 4 beats. The first note came. The second fell half a step too low. The third carried the sound of a string that hadn't been pressed firmly enough, a rasping sound of string and wood. The fourth wasn't a note at all, only the sound of the bow sliding across the strings. She stopped. She lowered the violin into her lap and sat upright without apologizing. Ezra didn't applaud. He didn't tell her it had been beautiful. He didn't say what a shame it was, and he didn't turn his face away in the way people did after seeing something they shouldn't have seen. He looked at the violin resting in her lap. Then he asked, "What was his name?" "Aiden," Josie said. "Aiden Keene." "What kind of work did he do?" Ezra asked, and Josie said, "I just told you. He was a carpenter." Ezra said, "I know. I mean, how did he work? Was he employed by a company, or did he work for himself?" "For himself," Josie said. "He had a truck and rented a workshop at the end of the street. He took jobs from people around the neighborhood. He repaired doors for elderly women and built shelves. Once, a family asked him to repair a chair, and after he finished, he wouldn't take any money for it. He always came home with sawdust caught in his collar." Ezra listened, and he didn't ask how Aiden had died. He asked whether Aiden had loved his work, and Josie had to think for a moment before answering, because in 4 years, no one had asked her a question like that about Aiden. People had only asked whether she was all right. He loved it very much, Josie said at last. And then she continued, not because Ezra asked another question, but because she had begun and couldn't stop. That last night was the dress rehearsal for my class at the church hall, and Aiden came. He always came. He sat in the last row, with sawdust still caught in the collar of his coat. The children couldn't stand in a straight line on the platform. They kept shuffling back and forth. One stood almost entirely behind another, and one kept turning to look at the door to see whether her parents had arrived. I counted the beat, and they managed to come in together for exactly one measure. Then one of them blew a note sharp, so high it sounded like a car horn. The whole hall went silent for a second. Then the child who had played it started laughing first, and the entire class began laughing with her. They laughed so hard they had to put down their instruments. I laughed too, and in the last row, Aiden applauded louder than anyone else in the room. He clapped as though he had just heard a full orchestra. He stood up to applaud. The entire room laughed for more than a minute. Josie stopped and used one hand to turn the violin case slightly on the table. Ezra said nothing to carry the story forward. He simply waited. Then she said, "It was raining that night, and Route 24 was wet. I was sitting in the passenger seat. I don't remember anything. I remember Aiden reaching across to turn on the heat for me, and after that, I remember nothing. I've spent 4 years trying to remember that missing part, and I still can't. Now I think I never will. And perhaps that is the only merciful thing in this entire story. He died right then. That is what they told me later. I went through 3 operations." She said 3 operations in the voice of someone reading a line from a piece of paper, placing no emphasis on any word. I woke after the last one. The ceiling was white, and an air duct ran across it. I remember that duct. A doctor was standing at the foot of my bed, and he didn't say anything. He simply stood there and waited for me to ask. He waited very patiently. He knew what I was going to ask, and I knew what I had to ask. But I didn't ask that question. I lay there and heard myself ask a different one. I asked whether I would ever be able to play the violin again. The doctor answered that question. He spoke about my left hand, the tendons, and the 2 fingers. He spoke very carefully and very kindly, and he answered the question I had asked in full. He didn't have to answer the other one. I had already read the answer on his face before he even opened his mouth. I saw it the moment he walked into the room and chose to stand at the foot of the bed instead of beside my head. So I didn't ask. I lay there and let him leave, and I didn't ask. In 4 years, I still haven't spoken that question aloud to anyone. Josie fell silent. The only sound left in the kitchen was the hum of the refrigerator. Ezra sat upright in his chair with both hands resting on the tabletop. He didn't reach across to her. He didn't say anything that began with the words, "I'm so sorry." He didn't tell her she was very strong. He didn't say that everything was over now. He left the silence exactly as it was, long enough for it to become a true silence, rather than an empty space waiting to be filled. Then he stood, pushed his chair back against the table, and said, "Thank you for telling me about him." He used the precise words about him, not about what happened. Then he walked away, but at the door, he stopped and said, "That inlay around the face of the violin would have taken a great deal of time. I work in construction, so I know. A person only gives that much time to something they truly love." Then he left. On Tuesday, Josie asked Bertie for the morning off, saying she needed to go to the drugstore. Bertie looked at her for 1 second, then told her to go and simply be back before 11 o'clock, and she didn't ask which drugstore. Josie took a bus to Pawtucket with the envelope in her pocket. The return address led her to a row of low houses near the bridge, and the woman who answered the door said the girl had moved away in the spring, but still worked at the diner on the main street, the one with the illuminated sign shaped like a coffee cup. The diner was quiet because it was only a little after 9 o'clock, and the girl was wiping down the sugar jars at the counter. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with her hair tied high, and when Josie gave her name and said the 3 words, "The Vasari House," both of the girl's hands stopped on the sugar jar. She looked toward the door, then she looked into the kitchen. Then she told Josie to sit at the table in the far corner, and she brought over 2 cups of coffee that no one had ordered. "I don't want to talk about it," she said the moment she sat down. "I already signed the papers. I signed a paper when I left." Josie said, "I didn't come here to ask about anything. I only wanted to know whether you were all right." The girl gave a short laugh with no amusement in it and said, "I work here. I can pay my rent." That means I'm all right." Then she sat silently with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and she didn't mention a single name. She referred to Margot only as she. She called her she throughout the entire conversation and didn't once speak the name Winslow aloud. Josie realized the girl was doing it deliberately. The way people avoided naming something because giving it a name would bring it into the room. Josie asked how long she had worked there, and the girl said less than 2 weeks. Then she said, "I didn't do anything wrong. I cleaned, I cooked, I pushed the chair, and I did the work I was hired to do. I just looked too closely." Josie set down her cup. In her mind, she saw Bertie leaning against the kitchen table with a towel in her hand, and she remembered the rule Bertie had advised her to make her own. Then the girl asked the question Josie hadn't come there to hear. "Do you know why you were hired?" Josie said. "Because the employment agency placed me there." The girl shook her head. "No," she said. "That house didn't need another housekeeper. It already had Bertie, a gardener, and someone who came every month to clean the windows. She didn't need another person to clean. She needed someone who knew how to bow her head. And she went looking for that person herself. The day I arrived, the manager at the employment agency left a folder of applicants on the table and stepped out of the room. I was sitting there alone, and I saw it. The folder was thick, with dozens of names inside. Someone had written on it in blue ink, and the handwriting wasn't the manager's. Some names had been crossed out, and others had been circled. My name was crossed out with a line drawn straight through the middle. I remember because I looked at my own name crossed out. And then I was still called in for the job. I thought someone must have crossed it out by mistake." She looked at Josie. A few lines below my name, there was another name circled twice. Keene. Josie said nothing. She sat there looking down at the tabletop, at the curved scratch in the plastic where people had dragged plates across it thousands of times, and she stared at that mark for a very long time. A radio played softly in the kitchen. Someone opened the door. The bell rang, and the customer ordered a pastry to take away. The girl drank her coffee. Josie still said nothing, and in that silence, she counted the 4 months she had spent in that house. She counted every afternoon on the slope leading to the boathouse. She counted the thin blanket folded into 4 neat sections and placed across that woman's legs. She counted the previous afternoon on the veranda, when she had knelt to adjust a footrest that had never been crooked and held out her left hand for 2 guests to examine. For 4 months, every time Josie placed her hands on the handles of that wheelchair, the woman sitting in it had known exactly who she was. That night, the weather turned cold earlier than it had in other years, the chill rising from the water, and Josie lay in the servants' room listening to the wind strike the shutters without sleeping at all, because every time she closed her eyes, she saw a name circled twice in blue ink. At nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, she went down to the kitchen for water. The kitchen light was already on. Ezra sat at the head of the table, and before him was a glass of water instead of coffee. His right leg stretched straight out in front of him, his heel resting on a rung of the chair opposite. "I'm sorry," Josie said. "I didn't know you were." "It's all right," he said. "Sit down." She didn't sit. She stood at the sink and poured herself a glass of water, and while she poured, he reached down and gripped his right knee through the fabric of his trousers, pressing and holding it there, the gesture of someone who had done the same thing thousands of times and no longer noticed himself doing it. "It stiffens when the weather turns cold," he said without looking up. "A little more every year." Then he said, "This knee was shattered when I was 19. Josie set her glass on the table. She didn't ask a question. She simply sat down in the chair 2 places away from him. And perhaps it was because she didn't ask that he continued. "There is a narrow road in Foster, out west, a road with 2 lanes and no lights. There are high banks of earth on both sides, with ditches beyond them. My father and I were coming home from work. He was driving. The car rolled into the ditch, and the bank was higher than the top of the car, so from the road above, no one could see anything. They couldn't see the car, the lights, or anything at all." He took a sip of water. "My father died immediately," he said. "Immediately. I know because I was an arm's length from him, and I called to him over and over, and he never answered me once. I was trapped. This leg was caught in something, though I still don't know what. I only knew I couldn't pull it free, and I remained down there for an entire night and the following morning." He spoke in the voice someone might use to share a fact about the weather in another city. Josie didn't move. "The worst part wasn't the pain," he said. "After a while, pain becomes something far away. The worst part was the sound of the cars. All night, Cars passed above me. There weren't many, but there were some. Each time one passed, I heard it approaching from far away. The sound grew louder, then faded, and then it was gone. In the morning, there were more cars, because people were going to work. I counted them until at some point I stopped counting. There were people up there. Someone was listening to the radio. Someone was drinking coffee in the car. Someone was wondering what to have for dinner that night. Not one of them knew that beneath that bank were two people. One who no longer needed anyone to come and one who did. He stopped, then said, "By noon, I managed to pull my leg free. I don't remember how. I crawled up. That bank wasn't long, fewer than 40 steps for someone walking, but it took me the entire morning to crawl it. I reached the side of the road and lost consciousness there. The woman who found me was on her way to work the afternoon shift. She thought I was a drunk sleeping beside the road. Only the sound of the wind against the shutters remained in the kitchen. Then Ezra said, "I didn't build the elevator in this house for Margot." He said it plainly, without anything in his voice. "People say I built it for her, and I tell everyone I built it for her. But I didn't. I built it for the 19-year-old boy who lay in that ditch in Foster. The boy who spent an entire night listening to people pass above him. Every time I push her chair across a threshold in this house, I become the person who arrived in time one more time. Do you understand? I couldn't save him, but every morning, I'm allowed to save someone, and I need that. I need it more than she needs me." On Wednesday morning, Gus arrived carrying a leather briefcase and a thick stack of papers held inside a blue cover. He left it on the desk in the study and went out onto the veranda to make a telephone call, while Josie entered to clean the desk as she did every Wednesday morning. The documents had been left open. They were open to a summary page, the kind of page that appeared at the beginning of every section in every legal file in the country, with 1 or 2 sentences written in plain language, so that even someone who had never studied law could understand what the section concerned. Josie didn't read it. She wiped the surface of the desk around the papers, lifted the lamp, cleaned beneath it, and put the lamp back in place. Then her eyes passed over the page once, the way someone's eyes might pass over a newspaper lying on another person's table, and she caught the words Protective Care Trust, medical expenses, and beneficiary. She thought what anyone else would have thought, that the man who lived in this house was making provisions for his future wife, even for the years after he was no longer there. She finished cleaning. She had already taken the cloth and reached the door when she stopped. She didn't understand legal terminology. She had never studied a single word of law, and she couldn't identify anything wrong with the page she had just seen. She had merely noticed a name in a place where it shouldn't have been. She returned to the desk. She turned to the summary page of the next section, then the one after that. In a section whose heading referred to shipping documents, customs records, and people authorized to sign on someone else's behalf, the name Margot Winslow appeared again in bold print, surrounded by words Josie couldn't understand. She stood staring at the name. In the section concerning medication, wheelchairs, and caregivers, that name belonged exactly where it was, but it had no reason to appear in a section about ships and customs documents, and Josie didn't need to understand the law to know that. She needed only to know that a woman who couldn't walk had no business with documents at the harbor. Then she did something she had learned at a price no one should ever have to pay. She turned to one of the final pages. 4 years earlier, while she was still recovering, she had signed a settlement document that her mother had brought into her room. Only much later had Josie understood that the most important thing in a stack of papers was never on the first page. It was always near the end, where people knew the reader's eyes had already grown tired. Near the end was a page containing only a few lines, some kind of company resolution, with Margot Winslow's name on the line above and an empty space below awaiting Ezra Vasari's signature. At noon that day, Josie brought Ezra his coffee. She stopped at the edge of his desk and asked him a single question. "Have you read the documents you're supposed to sign at the party on Saturday?" Ezra raised his head. He looked at her, and Josie saw his face change. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't become visibly angry. It was simply as though a door had closed behind his eyes. "Gus has prepared documents for my family for 15 years, he said. "He prepared the papers when my father died. He prepared the papers when Sloan went into the hospital. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Josie said, "I understand." "Concern yourself with your own work," he said. He spoke in his usual voice, the voice that never rose, and because of that, it closed more firmly than any shout could have done. She said yes, and walked out. That afternoon, She went to Providence to visit her mother, and that evening, she returned on a late bus. When the bus reached the road along the bay, she noticed a vehicle behind them, a dark SUV, and she noticed it not because it followed closely, but because it did nothing at all. It maintained exactly the same distance, neither drawing closer nor falling back. The road was empty. Several other vehicles passed the bus and disappeared ahead. The SUV didn't pass. The bus stopped twice, opened its doors, closed them, and continued on. And each time it began moving again, the SUV remained at precisely the same distance. Josie sat near the back and watched through the rear window, where she saw two beams of headlights, holding still in the darkness like two things waiting. When they reached the sign marking the town limits, the SUV turned on its signal and drove away. The telephone rang at nearly 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, while Josie was hanging towels to dry in the backyard, and the voice on the other end sounded like someone reading words that had been written in advance. Miss Keene, we regret to inform you that the Institute is restructuring its bed assignments in the left wing, and Deirdre Keene's case has been selected for transfer. We need you to complete the move before the end of this week, Josie said. I don't understand. My mother has been there for 4 years. The person said. Yes, we understand. This decision came from the administration. Josie asked where her mother was supposed to go, and the person said she would have to arrange that herself, because they were only providing the notification. Josie asked who had signed the notice. The person went silent for a beat, then read out a name. Josie asked why her mother had been chosen, and the person said, I don't have that information. Josie asked whom she could speak to, and the person said that individual wasn't there that day. That was how the call ended. Josie stood in the backyard with a wet towel in her hand. Then she walked around to the steps at the back of the house and sat on the top step, but she couldn't remain sitting upright, so she collapsed against the doorframe, the telephone still in her hand and the screen still glowing. For 4 years, her mother had slept in that bed beside the window, eaten at that small table, and walked through those same hallways. Now they were telling Josie that she had to move her before the end of the week, and the week ended tomorrow night. Tomorrow night was the engagement party, and Josie had $9,000 in her account, and nowhere to take her mother. Ezra came through the side door with a ring of keys in his hand, and he saw her. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He didn't ask what was wrong. He stood at the bottom of the steps and asked for the name of the institute. Harbor Light, Josie said. Outside Providence. He asked for the name of the person who had signed the notice. Josie looked up at him, and in that moment, her mind held every reason not to answer. There was the paper she had signed when she began working there. There was the long room behind the restaurant, where 8 men had stood along the walls. There were Rosalie's words that such places didn't belong to people like them. Then Josie spoke the name. She said it because she had nothing left to lose, and she knew exactly what she was doing. Ezra said nothing more. He didn't say that he would look into it. He didn't tell her not to worry. He simply nodded once and went back into the house, and Josie heard the study door close. She remained on the steps. She looked at the yard, the clothesline, and the towel she was still holding. 37 minutes later, her telephone rang again. It was Harbor Light. This time, the voice belonged to a manager, who said, Miss Keene, we sincerely apologize. There has been an error in the records. Deirdre's room isn't subject to transfer. Her room is private, and her expenses have already been paid in full for the entire year. You have nothing to worry about, Josie said. I haven't paid for the entire year, the manager said. The records show that it has been paid, Miss Keene. Josie asked about the person who had signed the notice that afternoon, and the manager said that person no longer worked there. The manager spoke those words in the voice of someone who had just been instructed to say them exactly that way. Josie stood in the downstairs hallway with the telephone pressed to her ear. The call had ended, but her hand remained there. What passed through her then wasn't gratitude. She had waited for gratitude to come. She had been prepared to feel it, but it never arrived. What came instead was a chill that began at the back of her neck and traveled downward. In 37 minutes, a man sitting in a study fewer than 20 steps from where she stood had made several telephone calls, and a nursing home in another city had changed its records, changed a room, and even changed one of the people who worked there. 37 minutes. She looked at the number of minutes on the screen, and she remembered it. Ezra came out of the study and saw her standing there. Did they call you back? He asked. Yes, she said. How much do I have to repay you? He stopped. Josie continued, her voice trembling. but she finished what she needed to say. "I need to know what I owe you now. I need to know how long it will take before that debt is paid." Ezra looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "My father kept a ledger. Everyone who owed this family, and everyone this family owed, was written down in it. I kept that ledger, and I still add to it. But there is no debt in that book because someone's mother grew old. That isn't a debt." Then he wished her good night and went upstairs. On Friday morning, Bertie told Josie to go to Providence. The party was tomorrow afternoon, and if she still had time to go today, then she should go. Josie took the 9 o'clock bus. Her mother was sleeping when she arrived, her head tilted to one side on the pillow, her mouth slightly open, and the notebook lay on the small table beside the bed with the ballpoint pen tucked between its pages. Josie sat down in the plastic chair and remained there in silence for a very long time. Then she thought of the name circled twice in blue ink. She thought of 37 minutes. She thought of how, tomorrow afternoon, she would stand in the corner of the rooftop terrace, holding a tray, while 200 people applauded. She didn't know why, but at that moment, she reached out and picked up the notebook. She hadn't opened it in 4 years. She opened it near the middle. The writing was large and distorted, the lines sloping downward toward the right corner, and Josie had to tilt her head to read it. She read one line, then she read it again. She turned to the previous page, then the page before that, then went all the way back to the beginning of the notebook. She began turning the pages faster and faster, and on every page in that entire notebook, among confused lines about lunch, the window, and a missing sweater, the same message had been written again, and again, and again. "The girl in the other car is named Winslow. Tell Josie, before Mom forgets." On the first pages, the handwriting was still straight and even, with a period at the end of every sentence, the writing of a woman who had once prepared invoices and left messages on notes attached to the refrigerator. After several dozen pages, the writing began to lean. Then the letters began drifting apart. On one page, she had managed only half the sentence. "The girl in the other car is named Win," before stopping. On the line below, she had started again from the beginning, and this time completed it. On one page, she wrote the message 3 times in succession. On another, she wrote it once in letters so large they covered the entire page, as though making the words larger might help them remain longer. On the pages near the end, the writing had become so distorted that Josie had to piece together every stroke before she could recognize the letters. Once, her mother had misspelled Winslow as Winslow, then written it correctly again on the line below. Josie turned to the final page containing any writing. There were only a few marks there, almost no longer recognizable as letters, but she could still make out the first 3 strokes of that surname, and beneath them were the 2 words, "Tell Josie." She lowered the notebook into her lap and sat there without making a sound, because her mother was sleeping. Then she remembered everything in the order it was meant to be remembered. 4 years ago, she had lain in a recovery room unable to do anything for herself, while people brought documents, page after page of them. Her mother had been the one sitting in the hospital corridor reading every sheet, with the plastic bag containing Aiden's belongings resting at her feet. Her mother had spoken to the lawyer. Her mother had brought the settlement papers into Josie's room, pointed to the place where she needed to sign, and Josie had signed without reading a single line. In 4 years, she still hadn't opened those documents because opening them would mean reading that night again on paper. But her mother had read everything. Her mother had reached the page containing the name. 6 months later, she had begun to forget, and she had known she was forgetting. For 4 years, she had sat beside that window with the cheapest student notebook money could buy, writing the same name over and over so that it wouldn't disappear. Everyone at the institute had believed she wrote, because she was confused. Josie had looked at that notebook hundreds of times and believed the same thing, and she had never once opened it. Her mother stirred. She opened her eyes, looked at the ceiling, then turned toward Josie. "Are you in the room on the right?" she asked. Josie said, "I'm Josie," Deirdre said. "Josie," then looked down and saw the notebook in her daughter's lap. She reached out, not to take it back, but only to rest her hand upon it. "I'm trying to remember something," she said. "I keep trying, but I can't. It's very important." Josie lifted that hand and pressed it against her cheek. "You remembered, Mom," she said. "You remembered." Deirdre said, "Did I?" Then she said she was tired and went back to sleep. Josie returned to Newport on the afternoon bus with the notebook in her coat pocket. She entered the servants' room, closed the door, pulled her suitcase from beneath the bed, and took from its bottom a large brown envelope whose corners had gone soft with age. She placed it on the bed. She sat looking at it for a while. Then she opened it, and she didn't begin at the first page. She turned directly to one of the final pages. It was an addendum containing several lines of small print, and in the lower right corner was a signature written in blue ink, graceful and practiced, the kind of signature belonging to someone who had rehearsed writing her own name since childhood. Margot Elizabeth Winslow. She called the county prosecutor's office before dark, while she was still sitting on the bed with the brown envelope open before her, and an automated recording told her that the office was open from Monday through Friday, during regular business hours. It was Friday afternoon, and the hands of the clock had already passed the closing hour by more than an hour, so it would have to be Monday. Not because she was hesitating, because Monday was the earliest day in this world when she could go there, and between her and Monday lay tomorrow night. She went down to the kitchen at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, because she could no longer remain in bed. She sat in the chair beside the kitchen table, the place where she always sat, and placed her telephone on the wooden surface before her. Among her contacts was a number Ezra had recited for her to save on the evening. He apologized to her in this doorway, his private number, one that went through no one else. She opened it. The screen glowed in the dark kitchen, and his name was there, her finger resting against the glass 1 knuckle away from the call button. She thought of the long room behind Rosalie's restaurant, where 8 men had stood along the walls while empty chairs waited 1 step away from them. She thought of a cup of coffee no one drank. She thought of 37 minutes and a nursing home in another city that had changed its records, changed a room, and changed even one of the people who worked there, all within 37 minutes, because one man had asked 2 questions and heard 2 names. If she touched the place on the screen, she would need to say only 3 sentences. She can walk. She was driving that night on Route 24. My husband's name was Aidan Keene, 3 sentences. And after that, she wouldn't have to do anything else. Someone else would take over, and she would never know what they did. She wouldn't have to know, and that was precisely what kept her finger suspended there for so long. The kitchen light came on. Bertie stood in the doorway wearing a robe, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, and she didn't ask what Josie was doing there. She looked at the glowing telephone on the table. She studied it for a long time, and Josie understood that she had read the name on the screen. Then Bertie walked over, pulled out the chair opposite Josie, and sat down with both hands resting on the table. She spoke in her ordinary voice, the same voice she used to say that the soup was still hot. I've been in this house since he was too young to walk. I know what he is capable of doing. I also know he would do it for you if you asked him. She reached out one finger and gently touched the edge of the telephone, touching it without pushing it away. Then she said, "Are you going to let that woman take the last decent part of you as well?" Josie didn't answer. Bertie said, "That woman took your husband from you. She took your hand. She took 4 years of your life, and she took your work from you. Now you intend to give her everything that remains. Once you've done that, what will you have left to carry to your mother?" The screen went dark because no one had touched it for too long. The only sound in the kitchen was the hum of the refrigerator. Josie reached out, turned the telephone face down on the table, then pushed it beyond the reach of her hand. She remained there until her hand stopped trembling. Then she said, "I won't tell him about Aidan. Not now, not tomorrow night, and not at any time before this is over." Bertie nodded. Josie said, "On Monday, I'll go to the county prosecutor's office. I'll sit there until someone agrees to listen to me. I'll tell them everything, and I'll give them everything I have." Bertie asked, "What about tomorrow night?" Josie looked through the kitchen window at the dark yard, at the place where, by tomorrow afternoon, there would be 200 chairs, a platform, and strings of lights stretched overhead. "Tomorrow night, I'll finish my shift," she said. "I'll carry trays, pour water, and clear the plates. I'll finish my work, and then I'll leave. I don't want anyone in this house to remember me as someone who walked away in the middle of her shift." On Saturday afternoon, a white fabric canopy was stretched over half the rooftop terrace. A small platform was erected at the inner end, and a long table was placed against the western wall. By 7 o'clock, 200 people had arrived. Josie finished her shift exactly as she had told Bertie she would. She poured water, changed plates, and walked behind the rows of chairs so that she wouldn't block anyone's view. Each time she passed Margot's wheelchair, she checked the brake with a single glance, exactly as Bertie had taught her during her first week. Look only long enough to know the brake was set, and then look away. Gus stood at the end of the long table with the blue folder before him, and beside it lay a pen, placed horizontally and ready to be used. Sloane arrived later than the other guests, and chose her own place, as she always did. She chose a spot near the eastern edge of the terrace, because the ramp leading down was directly beside it. And in 8 years, Sloane had never once sat anywhere that required her to ask someone else to push her when she wanted to leave. Margot was positioned beside her, angled toward the platform, where the light would be best for photographs. Then Ezra stepped onto the platform, and the entire terrace fell silent. He didn't speak for long. He thanked everyone for coming and thanked his mother for cooking. Then he said what he had come there to say. He said people often claimed that love meant sharing, but he didn't believe that. He said love meant carrying for another person the very thing they could no longer carry themselves, carrying it without asking questions, without keeping count, and carrying it even on the days when you had no strength left of your own. He said he hadn't learned that from any book, but from a morning long ago that he wouldn't speak about there. Applause rose from the guests. Rosalie stood in the kitchen doorway, and she didn't clap. She simply looked at her son. Then Ezra said there was one small matter left that evening. Only some documents. A trust that would provide for Margot in the years ahead no matter what happened to him. He would sign it before everyone, because he wanted every person present to bear witness to the words he had just spoken. Gus opened the blue folder. At that exact moment, the wind from the bay changed direction. It arrived like a solid wall instead of a series of gusts, the kind of violent wind people in that region called a wind that chased the rain, and the white canopy swelled like a sail. A glass toppled on the long table. People rose from their chairs and lifted their hands to hold their hair, while someone laughed loudly out of embarrassment. Josie was standing about 4 steps from Margot's wheelchair with a tray in her hands, and she was the only person on that terrace who looked upward. She looked because she had stood in that exact place all afternoon watching the workers secure the canopy. She saw a rope at the eastern corner snap free from its fastening. She saw it fly upward, and she saw one end of the horizontal steel bar holding the edge of the canopy slip loose and swing downward in a slow arc, a very slow arc, toward the eastern edge of the terrace, where one wheelchair stood angled beneath the lights, and another sat directly beside it. There were 200 people on that terrace, and not one of them knew where the brake on that wheelchair was, how to release it, or which direction to turn the chair to move it out of danger as quickly as possible. Only 2 people knew. One was Josie because she had done it every day for 4 months. The other was Sloane, and Sloane was sitting in that very place, unable to reach the chair beside her. Josie dropped the tray. She had the length of a single breath, and within that breath, she looked at the 2 wheelchairs and chose. She lunged to the right, toward Sloane, struck both hands against the brake levers, then seized the handles and pulled backward with all the force of her body. Sloane's chair rolled away from the edge of the terrace, with the momentum of that pull as Josie screamed the other woman's name. Then everything on the terrace stopped. Margot Winslow planted both hands on the arms of her wheelchair, rose from the seat, turned, and ran. She ran several steps into the circle of light before the platform, quickly and steadily, both feet striking the stone beneath her exactly like the feet of someone who walked every day. She stopped in the center of that light, with 200 pairs of eyes fixed upon her. The steel bar completed its arc and crashed down onto the empty wheelchair. No one said a word. Rain began to fall against the fabric canopy. The only person injured on that terrace was the maid, who had a cut across her left forearm, with blood running down her sleeve. The first person to break the silence was Margot. She stood in the center of the light with both hands extended before her like someone awakening from a trance, and she began to cry. "Oh God," she said. "I don't understand. I don't understand any of this. I saw the steel bar. That was all I saw. Then suddenly my body did something I couldn't control." She turned toward the guests and said, "Has anyone here ever heard of this? They say that in moments of danger, the body can do things it ordinarily can't. I've read about it. There are stories of people lifting cars." Then she said, "Ezra, this is a miracle. I have to call my doctor tonight." Whispers moved through the guests, and somewhere in the back, a woman said, "It truly is a miracle." Josie stood beside Sloane's wheelchair, with blood running down her sleeve, and listened as the murmuring spread like water flowing across the stone. She understood that if it were allowed to spread all the way, then by morning, everyone in Newport would believe exactly what had just been said. Then Sloane rolled forward. She propelled herself into the center and stopped about 2 steps from where Margot stood. She sat there looking up and spoke in the very slow voice of someone reading from a list she had checked carefully. "First," she said, "I've been in this wheelchair since I was 16 years old, and my calves are smaller now than they were then. Much smaller. That happens to anyone who sits for years. No one escapes it. You just walked across wet stone on 2 legs that haven't grown smaller at all. Second, when someone has used a wheelchair for a long time, her shoulders and hands do all the work. My palms have calluses, near my thumbs and beneath my fingers, calluses that any dermatologist would recognize within 2 seconds. Hold out your hands and let everyone see them." Margot didn't hold out her hands. "Third," Sloane said, speaking even more slowly than she had before, "when you stood, you pressed both hands against the arms of your chair, then pushed your body forward and upward. You performed precisely the movement people have to practice for months before they can do it without losing their balance. The body doesn't invent a movement like that in the space of one breath. It only repeats what it has already done thousands of times." The entire terrace was silent. Then Margot did something no one there expected. She stopped crying. She straightened her body and didn't deny a single word of the 3 things she had just heard. She merely turned, pointed toward Josie, and said, "That girl turned my chair. I was sitting angled toward the platform. Everyone here saw me sitting that way. But when the wind rose, she came over, turned my chair toward the edge, then abandoned me there and ran to the other side. 200 people just watched it happen. Is there anyone here who didn't see her run to the other side?" And the worst part was this. 200 people had just seen Josie rush forward, change direction as she ran, and leave the other wheelchair behind. As an image, Margot hadn't said a single word that was untrue. Josie opened her mouth and realized there was nothing she could say, because everything she could say was something she couldn't prove, and everything she could prove had already been demonstrated by what she had done with her own 2 hands. Gus immediately stepped away from the long table, the pen still in his hand. "I saw it," he said loudly. "I was standing here with a clear view. I saw her touch Margot's wheelchair first." Then he took out his telephone and told the guard at the head of the driveway to call security to the terrace. He told someone on the telephone to call the family lawyer, then turned to 2 men standing near the door and said, "Keep her here. Don't let her leave the terrace until someone with authority arrives." A hand closed around Josie's elbow. She didn't pull away. She stood there, with the cut across her forearm, staring down at the wet stone, and she thought of Monday. She thought that perhaps Monday had just been taken from her hands. Then Sloane turned her chair and said, "Take your hands off her." She spoke to Gus, not to Ezra. "Put your telephone away." She didn't turn anyone's chair. She came to me, and she came to me because I'm the one person on this terrace who can't stand up by herself. She looked at Margot. You, on the other hand, just ran several steps. All the guests left within half an hour. No one said goodbye to anyone, and Rosalie stood at the head of the driveway thanking each person as though the evening had been perfectly ordinary. Josie found Ezra in the kitchen. He stood at the sink with his back to the door, both hands gripping the edge of the stone counter on either side, his head slightly bowed. He didn't strike anything. He didn't throw anything. The kitchen was so quiet that Josie could hear water dripping from the faucet. She stood in the doorway without speaking, and after a while, he said without turning around, his voice still perfectly ordinary, not rising even half a note, "I thought this time I had finally arrived in time." He said, "Every morning, I pushed that chair across a threshold and believed I had arrived in time." Then he released the stone and straightened, and Josie saw that where his right hand had been gripping the counter, a fresh crack ran diagonally across its edge, about the length of a handspan, its edges still sharp. He saw it too. He said nothing about it. Then he reached for the telephone resting on the kitchen table. Josie stepped forward and placed her hand over his, directly on the glass screen, and said, "Please don't." He stood still. She didn't explain. She didn't tell him why. She simply left her hand there. After a while, he withdrew his hand and set the telephone down. "I have to go out," he said. Then he left. But Josie had noticed something on the terrace while Sloane was stating her 3 points, and all 200 guests were looking toward Margot. Josie had looked toward the long table. There, Gus had closed the blue folder, picked it up, slipped it into his leather briefcase, and left by the side path. No one noticed him because no one was thinking about documents anymore that night. Josie was. She thought about the page near the end, the name placed where it had no reason to be, and the empty space waiting for a signature. She knew one very simple thing with absolute certainty. By morning, those documents would no longer exist anywhere in the world. At nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, she heard Gus start his car in the rear drive. She was already wearing her coat. She walked to the main road, caught the night delivery truck Bertie often used to transport fish, and got out at the harbor gate. That night, the docks held only the glare of tall floodlights and the sound of water. She walked between 2 rows of shipping containers through the yellow light, and found Gus's car parked in front of a warehouse whose rolling door was raised halfway. She went inside. There were iron shelves, stacks of crates, a steel table, and a hanging lamp. Gus stood at the steel table with the blue folder open before him, and beside him were 2 men Josie had never once seen at the Vasari house. Both wore heavy coats, and neither belonged to the family. Gus looked up and didn't appear surprised at all. "Go home," he said. Josie walked to the steel table, placed her hand on the documents, and pulled them toward herself. She didn't run. She simply lifted them with both hands and held them against her chest. "Give them to me," Gus said. She didn't. The 2 men stepped forward, one on either side of her. One reached out and took hold of her elbow, while the other positioned himself between her and the rolling door. No one struck her. No one drew a weapon. 3 men stood around one woman inside a warehouse at 2 o'clock in the morning, and all they needed was for her to open her hands. Gus said, "Do you know what you're holding?" Josie said, "I don't know. I only know about the page near the end," Gus said. "You don't understand a single word written in there." Josie said, "No, I don't." Then she tightened her grip. The rolling door behind her made a sound, and the light stretching across the concrete floor grew longer. Ezra entered. He didn't walk quickly. He moved at the same pace he always used in the hallways of his own house, and he stopped about 4 steps from the steel table. He looked at the hand gripping Josie's elbow. Then he spoke to Gus. He said one sentence in the voice that never rose. "Take your hand off her, then leave this warehouse, then leave the Vasari family, in that order." The hand released Josie's elbow. The 2 men stepped back, looked at Gus, then glanced toward the door. Gus said, "Ezra, listen to me first." Ezra didn't answer him. He turned toward Josie and looked at the documents she held against her chest. But he didn't reach for them. He didn't take them from her. He stood there and said, "May I see them?" Josie lowered her hands and gave Ezra the documents, and he accepted them with both hands. He placed them on the steel table beneath the hanging lamp, turned to one of the final pages, read it once, then read it again. Josie watched his shoulders, and she knew he had understood before he finished the second line. Gus was still standing there. The 2 men in heavy coats had left at some point, and the sound of their vehicle had already faded away. Ezra said nothing more to Gus. He walked around the steel table to the iron shelving behind it, where 3 boxes of documents were stacked, and lifted down the top box. Gus said, "That belongs to me." Ezra opened the lid. Inside were stiff folders arranged upright, each with a label along its edge. He moved through the labels with one finger, not quickly, and Josie stood beside him and saw his hand stop at one of them. He pulled it out. The folder contained expense reports from the construction branch 4 years earlier, pages whose corners had begun to yellow. Among the lines recording payments for materials and labor was a large payment to a law firm, and in the notes column were several handwritten words. "Legal assistance for the Winslow family." Ezra stared at that line for a long time. Then he said without turning around, "Gus, tell me." Gus didn't answer. Ezra continued for him, speaking in the voice of someone reading something aloud so that it would become real. "You didn't know her before. You paid for that case first, and only afterward did you come to know her. You paid her family's law firm because the Winslows were a Newport family, and you wanted a seat at the Newport table. You believed buying a favor like that would be inexpensive. Then you rose from that table with something worth far more than money. You were the only person outside that house who knew what she had done." Gus said, "You're accusing me unjustly." Ezra said, "Then 2 years later, you brought her into my home for dinner. You said she was the daughter of a business associate. You told me she had suffered, and you arranged for her to sit beside me. You didn't need someone to work with you. You needed someone you could hold in your hand, someone whose future you could end with a single telephone call, which meant she would sign anything you placed before her, including that page near the end." Gus said, "That trust was meant to provide for her." Ezra said, "That trust was meant to provide for you." Then he closed the stiff folder and stood motionless, and Josie saw his hand stop at another place on the page, At the bottom, on the line reserved for authorization, there was a signature there, his signature. Ezra stood staring at his own name on the document that had paid the law firm that protected the Winslow family 4 years earlier. Josie stood one step away and looked at it too, and neither of them spoke because there were no words in that warehouse that could be used. He hadn't known what he was authorizing, but his family's money had purchased a path away from justice for the person who had taken her husband from her. Footsteps sounded at the rolling door. Rosalie entered with a sweater pulled over her nightgown. She walked to the steel table and didn't look at the documents. She looked at her son. Then she said, "I knew." Ezra raised his head. She said, "I didn't know she could walk. I swear to you, I didn't know that. I suspected something else, something worse. I had suspected it since the first New Year's dinner she attended here. I suspected it because of the way Gus looked at her when she spoke. The way someone looks at an object he has left in another person's house. I intended to tell you." She stopped and gripped the edge of the steel table. "Then I didn't. Because you have been sleeping for the past 18 months. Since you were 19, this has been the first stretch of time when I could pass your room at midnight without seeing the light still burning. I traded the truth for your sleep. I'm your mother, and I made the wrong choice." Ezra said nothing to her. He reached across and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the edge of the steel table. Then he spoke to both women in the warehouse, though in truth, he was speaking to himself. He said that the doctor's conclusion after the accident near the bay had been based on Margot's genuine spinal scans from 4 years earlier, together with what she herself had reported about the sensation in her legs, and that there wasn't a doctor in the world who could prove that someone was lying about what she could feel. It was nearly dawn when they returned to the house, and Margot was sitting in the study on an ordinary chair rather than in a wheelchair, because her chair had been crushed beneath the steel bar and dragged to a corner of the terrace. Rosalie stood in the doorway. Sloane had already arrived and positioned her wheelchair beside the bookcase. Gus entered last, and he didn't sit down. Ezra placed the blue folder and the stiff-covered file side by side on the desk. He didn't need to say a single word of explanation, because the moment Margot saw those two covers lying beside each other, she understood everything. She looked at the stiff-covered file longer than she looked at the blue one. Then she said, "So you know." Ezra said, "I know." Margot said, "Then I'll tell you the part you still don't know." She rose from the chair and stood upright, and seeing her stand in that small room was somehow harder to bear than watching her run across the terrace. She looked toward Josie. "I didn't hire that girl to clean this house," she said. "This house has never lacked people to clean it. I sat at that employment agency for an entire afternoon and read every name in the folder until I found the exact surname I wanted. Keene. I circled it twice. I needed someone whose money was running out. Someone with a mother in a nursing home and a bed that had to be paid for every month. Someone who had to live in fear each time the month came around. I needed her inside my house, not out there, because if she remained out there, sooner or later she might try to reopen the case. I hired her so she would have something to lose." The room seemed to stop. Josie could hear the clock on the bookcase. Sloane didn't move. Rosalie lifted one hand to her mouth. Then Ezra did what no one in the room expected. He said nothing to Margot. He turned and looked at Josie. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, using a gentler, more intimate form of address than he had ever used with her before. He stood there waiting. Gus waited. The two men in the hallway, whom Josie hadn't known were there, waited as well. At that moment, the entire house was waiting for an answer from a maid. Josie knew exactly what she was being given. She had seen 8 men standing along the walls while empty chairs waited beside them. She had seen a nursing home in another city change its records, change a room, and change even one of its employees within 37 minutes. "I want you to do nothing," she said. Gus released a breath. Ezra didn't move. Josie continued, and her voice trembled through the first few words, then became steady. "If you make one telephone call tonight, then by tomorrow morning, this will become a story about the Vasari family. People will say that the Vasari family dealt with a woman from Newport, and they will repeat that story at every table in this city for the next 20 years. My husband won't be part of that story. He won't have a name. He will be the reason people mention briefly in the middle of a sentence before they go back to talking about you." She looked at Ezra and said, "I don't want that. I want a courtroom. I want an official record. I want a day when I can stand in a room full of strangers and say the name Aiden Keene aloud, loud enough for the clerk to write it down, loud enough for his name to remain on that paper after I'm dead. I want her to answer before a room like that, not before you. Then she spoke her final sentence, and she said it slowly. "If I let you deal with her, then I'm treating her like an object too. I would rather die than become like her." No one spoke. Since the age of 19, Ezra Vasari had never allowed another person to make a choice for him. But as dawn approached, he stood in his father's study and listened to a woman employed as a maid in his house tell him what she wanted. And he didn't argue with a single word. He nodded once. Then he said to Gus, "Give me the key to the warehouse." He turned toward the hallway and said, "Go home. There is nothing to be done tonight." To Margot, he said, "You will remain in this house until morning. Then you will return to your mother's home, and you won't leave this county because someone will come for you on Monday." Then he unlocked the bottom drawer of the desk and removed a ledger bound in leather, the one he had told Josie about in the hallway on the night Harbor Light called her back. He opened it and turned it toward her. Near the bottom of one page was her name, written in ink, together with the notation, 37 minutes. Josie looked at it. Then she said, "Remove me from that ledger. I don't want to exist as a debt in your house." Ezra picked up his pen and drew a line through the entry. Then he wrote several words in the margin that she couldn't read and closed the ledger. On Monday morning, Josie arrived at the county prosecutor's office at 9 o'clock with the brown envelope and the student notebook inside a cloth bag, and she sat among the waiting chairs for 2 hours before someone called her name. The person who met with her was an assistant prosecutor, a middle-aged woman with short hair, and she listened to Josie speak for 40 minutes without interrupting her once. Then she turned through the papers in the brown envelope until she reached the addendum and read the signature there. She opened the student notebook and slowly went through it from beginning to end, one page after another. When she reached the middle, she placed one hand on the paper and sat silently for a while. Josie said, "I signed a paper when I accepted the settlement money. I'm not allowed to speak about the case to anyone. I know I'm violating it, and I know I'll have to repay the money, but I don't have any of it left." The assistant prosecutor put down her pen. "Miss Keene, I need you to listen carefully to one thing, and I need you to remember it for the rest of your life. There isn't a document in this world that can prevent you from reporting a crime. Not one. People write those documents so that you will believe there is, and you have believed it for 4 years. Thousands of other people are believing the same thing while we sit here. What they bought from you wasn't your right to remain silent. What they bought was your fear." Josie remained still. The woman continued, "But I won't lie to you either. They can't prosecute you criminally, but they can sue you in civil court, and they will. They have lawyers who bill by the hour, and you don't. They will drag the case out until you are exhausted. I have seen more people abandon cases because of that than for any other reason. Do you understand?" Josie said, "I understand." Then she took the pen and signed her statement, using her right hand because her left couldn't hold a pen for long. When she reached the parking lot, Ezra's car was still in the same place where it had been at 9 o'clock that morning. He had been sitting inside it for more than 3 hours. He hadn't entered the building, called anyone, or spoken a single word to anyone inside. He simply opened the car door for her and asked whether she wanted something to eat. The following Sunday, the family ate together again, and Bertie set the table as she had set it since Ezra was too young to walk. She prepared every place. She set a bowl before Rosalie's seat, Sloane's seat, Ezra's seat, and Josie's seat, where Sloane had pulled out a chair for her the week before. Then she placed one bowl at the seat near the middle of the table on the right, the place Gus had occupied since he was a boy sent to fetch the bread. Gus stood in the dining room doorway. He didn't enter without permission. Ezra sat at the head of the table without looking up. "Bertie, please clear that bowl," he said. Bertie remained still for 1 second. Then she walked over, picked up the bowl, the spoon, and the folded napkin beside it, and carried everything into the kitchen. The sound of her placing them in the sink was the only sound in the room. Gus said, "Ezra, let me say one thing to you." Ezra still didn't look up. "You may keep the name," he said. "I can't take your name from you. It belongs to my father and yours, and I don't have the authority to take it. But from today onward, that name won't open a single door in Rhode Island. It won't open one at a bank, at the harbor, or anywhere people know my family, and it won't open a place at this table." Gus said, "Think again. I have a wife and children. I've worked for this family for 15 years. Ezra said. "I know." Gus said one more sentence, but his voice had changed. It was the voice of a man pleading. Ezra didn't look up. He cut the meat on his plate, set down his knife, and said, "Please go home." Gus stood there a little longer, then left. Rosalie reached for the plate of bread and passed it to Sloane first. Sloane passed it to Josie, and everyone continued eating. No one mentioned the empty place again. The case was reopened in late fall, and Deirdre Keene's student notebook was entered into the record as evidence. Every page was photographed, even the pages containing only a few marks, while the original was sealed inside a labeled plastic bag and stored in the court's evidence room. Josie asked whether she could have it back when everything was over. They told her she could. That winter, Deirdre grew weaker, not because of any new illness, but in the way people weaken after reaching the end of the road they were meant to travel. She ate less. She slept more. She stopped asking where Aiden was, and Josie had believed she would feel relieved when she no longer had to answer that question, but she didn't. One afternoon, Josie arrived and found her mother sleeping beside the window. She sat in the plastic chair and lifted her mother's hand into her own. Deirdre opened her eyes for a moment, looked at her, and said, "You're home now." She said those exact 3 words, then she went back to sleep. She passed away in her sleep the following night, without pain and without waking. The attendant on the night shift told Josie that when she entered the room, Deirdre's hands were still resting on her stomach like the hands of someone peacefully resting. On the table beside the bed was the ballpoint pen, but the notebook wasn't there because by then it was sealed inside a labeled plastic bag at the county courthouse. The funeral was small. Rosalie cooked. Bertie came. Sloane came. Ezra stood at the back of the chapel throughout the service and said nothing except one sentence to Josie outside the door. He told her that her mother was the bravest woman he had ever heard of. The sentencing hearing took place on a March morning. The courtroom was more crowded than Josie had expected. Members of the press were there, along with people from both sides and several others she didn't recognize. Margot Winslow sat at the table on the right between 2 attorneys, seated in an ordinary chair like everyone else in the room. When it was time for the victim's statement, the clerk called the name Josephine Keene, and Josie rose and walked to the front carrying 2 sheets of paper. Not one word on those pages had been written by her. She had spent 2 evenings with photographs of her mother's notebook, copying every line in the order it appeared, from the straight sentences at the beginning to the distorted lines near the end. The pages she carried to the table that morning held 4 years of one woman's life arranged in lines. "I would like permission to read my mother's words," she said. The judge told her to proceed. Josie read, "The girl in the other car is named Winslow. Tell Josie. Before Mom forgets." She read the message once, then again, repeating it exactly as many times as her mother had written it in the first part of the notebook, and no one in the courtroom moved. When she reached the middle, she read even the mistakes. She read the place where her mother had written Winslow and left off the final letter, then read the line beneath it, where Deirdre had written the name correctly. When she reached the final lines, the ones that had become little more than a few marks, she said, "I can't read all of this part, but I know what it says because the entire notebook contains only that one message." Then she placed the 2 sheets of paper on the table. "I have one more thing to say," she said. The judge told her to continue. Josie looked up at the room filled with strangers and spoke loudly. Louder than she had spoken at any moment in the past 4 years. Loudly enough for her voice to reach the final row. Loudly enough for the clerk seated below to type every word. "My husband's name was Aiden Keene. He was a carpenter in Fall River. He made doors, staircases, and cabinets, and he spent 1 year making a violin for me by hand. He died on the night of April 11th on Route 24. He was 29 years old. When she had finished, she stood still for 1 second and listened as the clerk's keyboard completed the final sentence and stopped. That was all she had ever wanted. She didn't seek Margot Winslow's eyes. She didn't look toward the table on the right even once from the moment she stepped forward until the moment she stepped down. She walked back toward her seat, and at the rear of the courtroom, leaning against the wall beside the exit, stood Ezra Vasari with both hands in the pockets of his coat. He said nothing, and as she passed him, he inclined his head once, very slightly, exactly as the gardener at his house always greeted Rosalie. By the beginning of summer, the music class opened in the long room behind Rosalie's restaurant. On the first day, Josie arrived early and stood in that doorway for 1 second before entering. Only 1 second. Then she stepped inside and began arranging the chairs. Sloane handled the paperwork, secured the permits, and applied for grants from the city council and 2 music stores in Providence. It was Sloane who insisted that the class needed an official name and that Josie needed a formal title on paper. Josie accepted the title and a salary paid from the grant, but she made it clear to Ezra from the beginning that she wouldn't accept his money, not a single cent. When he said he could authorize a payment without anyone knowing, she told him that was precisely why she wouldn't take it. If I do this work, then I must be paid for the work I do, not given money because of who I am. He listened, and he never raised the subject again. Every kind of student came. There were elderly women with arthritis whose fingers wouldn't bend as fully as they wanted, and they sat in the front row because they couldn't hear well. There was a middle-aged man in a wheelchair who arrived by bus carrying a borrowed violin. There were children in the back row, whose feet swung above the floor. Josie taught them something no music conservatory in the country taught, because no conservatory had ever believed it needed to. She didn't teach them how to play correctly. She taught them how to make music with the hands they had. She showed the elderly women how to change their fingering, use a stronger finger in place of a weaker one, and accept a different path along the fingerboard to reach the same note. She taught the man in the wheelchair how to adjust the height of his chair and the position of his shoulder, so that his right arm had enough room to move the bow. She told the entire class that the person who had written the music didn't know what their hands were like, so they owed him nothing. They would play as much as they were able to play. One day, in the middle of a lesson, a child in the back row drew 3 notes in succession. 3 clean notes without a rasp or a note out of tune. When the child finished, the sound startled him so much that he lifted the bow from the strings, and the entire room applauded. The elderly women clapped louder than anyone. The child smiled until his face turned red, then tried again. This time the notes were wrong, and the whole room laughed. Josie stood in the center of the room with the bow in her hand and thought of a church hall in Fall River, and she allowed the memory to pass through her. That Sunday at the Vasari house, Bertie set the table as she had set it since Ezra was too young to walk, then turned back toward the kitchen. Josie rose, walked to the corner of the room, pulled out a chair, and placed it in the empty space beside the table. Ezra asked no questions. He stood, went into the kitchen, brought out a bowl, a spoon, and a napkin, and placed them before that chair. Rosalie called into the kitchen, "Bertie, come eat with us." Bertie reached the kitchen doorway and stopped. She stood there for a long time with a dish towel still in her hand, looking first at the chair, then at the bowl, then at Rosalie. No one said another word. Then Bertie draped the towel over her shoulder, walked to the table, and sat down. That afternoon, Ezra asked Josie whether she wanted to walk out to the dock. They went down to the place where his father's boat had once been moored, where only 2 posts and the surface of the water remained. He didn't circle around what he wanted to say. He told her he had held this question in his hands for nearly a year, and hadn't asked it because he knew an old document still lay between them, one he could never erase. Then he asked. Josie didn't say yes. She took her left hand, the hand with 2 fingers that wouldn't bend, and placed it in his palm. She left it there for a while. Then she lifted that hand to her shoulder as though resting it on a violin that wasn't there, and with her right hand, she drew 4 beats through the air. She spoke all 4 notes aloud. The second was still wrong. The third still rasped. The fourth still failed to become a note at all. "It is still the same," she said, "and it will always be the same." Then she said, "Ask me again when the music class is full." Ezra said, "All right." Then he waited. This story leaves behind 3 truths. The first is that pretending to be disabled isn't merely lying to one man. It is stealing the compassion that rightfully belongs to people who truly struggle every day. People like Sloane and the man who traveled by bus to class carrying a borrowed violin. The second is that justice and revenge look alike from a distance, with only one difference. Revenge always makes us pay with whatever humanity we have left. The third is that no one is an object. Not the person carrying the tray, not the person sitting in the wheelchair, not the person who has cooked for one family throughout an entire lifetime, and not even the person who has hurt us most deeply. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it so that every day we can listen to another story of kindness together. How do you feel about Josie and her mother's notebook? Please leave a comment because we read every line and sincerely want to hear what you feel in the deepest part of your heart. May you and your entire family always have abundant health, peaceful lives, and happiness each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next story.